Hey everyone, my name is Emma Finn. I'll be your host today. I am the Communication and Training Coordinator here at LunchAssist. With me today, we have our resident expert and LunchAssist founder, Jen McNeil, and Camille Biazzo, one of our rockstar consultants and former procurement reviewer, who was a big support for the content here. She'll be chiming in during this call with her expertise. I also want to give a special shout out to Catherine Karnitz on Zoom controls, as well as the rest of the LunchAssist fam on the call today. Now, I'd like to give a special thanks to all of our customers for continuing to support us. If you're joining us today and are not currently a Lunch Assist Pro member, I encourage you to stick around until the end of the call to find out how you can join. So, today, Jen and I are going to be digging real deep into the school year 24-25 procurement review process. Back in June, we had a great procurement review workshop with our bid buddy Ben over at Shared Planning Strategies, during which Jen and Ben explained a lot about the procurement review, what it is, what the different procurement methods are, and even going through the different steps of the procurement review. If you didn't make it or haven't seen the recording yet, I highly recommend bookmarking that webinar as well. We'll put the link in the chat. Now, for the purpose of today's webinar, we really wanted to build on the knowledge that was shared back in June and get into more of the details that will help prepare all of you for this review. Here's what we'll be discussing today: the procurement review timeline in California, documentation required for phase 1, how to fill out the procurement table, completing the vendor paid list, documentation required for phase 2, and some pro tips for acing the review. Now, as we get started, please feel welcome to put any questions you may have in the chat. We will be answering these at the end of the call during our Q&A session. Woo! All right, Jen, Camille, are you ready? All right, to start us off, Jen, can you remind us again what the overall timeline is for the school year 24-25 procurement?
Yes, absolutely. Our timeline is it's an interesting timeline for the procurement review. So let's break it down. We've got everyone who's getting a procurement review should have been notified by CDE back in May. So in California, if you're getting a review this year, you can check the list and we'll put the link in the chat. And I just want to give an acknowledgement if we do have anyone out from outside of the state. Much of what we're sharing today, it follows the USDA guidelines. So it's applicable in most states, but the timeline will definitely vary by state. So keep that in mind if you're joining us from another state. So you can check that list for California. If you're selected, then CDE also should have sent you an email on September 3rd with the phase 1 documentation request. And then that documentation is due next Wednesday on October 2nd. And then in terms of timeline, it's called the school year 24-25 procurement review, but remember that school year 23-24 purchases, like the last completed year, is what's reviewed. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's what we're looking at. So here you can see the timeline that we're kind of looking at. So we know that phase 1 documentation is due next week. Once we submit that, then the rest of the timeline is kind of a little bit of a question mark because we don't know exactly when you will get your phase 2 documentation request. It kind of varies by your reviewer. At some point this school year, you'll get an email from your procurement reviewer that says, hey, this is your phase 2 documentation request. And we'll talk about what's included in that phase 2 documentation request in just a few minutes. But once you get that email, then 10 days later, you have to provide all that documentation. So you kind of hurry up and wait. And then as soon as you get the email, you have to like jump into action. Once you submit phase 2 documentation, typically between 1 and 3 months, it takes a couple of months for the CDE to complete their review. But once they do that, usually your reviews close out within about 3 months tops. So that's been what we've seen in previous years and kind of what CDE's laid out as the expectations for this year. They did mention, they gave us a little hint, and they said that districts should hear from their assigned reviewer by the end of October. So hopefully you do hear like that question mark come sooner than later, just so you kind of can get it wrapped up earlier in the school year. But we'll see what happens.
Okay, well, since phase 1 is due next week, October 2nd, Can you just remind us what is the documentation that is required for submitting phase one? And maybe Camille
Yes.
want to chime in.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have a little list here, and I highlighted a couple of things that we didn't cover in our last webinar that are a little bit newer. So we go into this in more detail. Like if you want even more information, definitely listen to that recording from June. So in an effort to not be too repetitive here, I won't go into too much detail on the stuff we covered then, but you can see here everything that's required. CDE did put out a procurement review checklist, so download that from CNIPS, and that has everything you can see here on the screen as well listed on it, so you can check that off, and you'll need to submit that with your documentation. Of course, the code of conduct and procurement procedures, that's standard, and there's templates in CNIPS and templates in LunchAssist Pro. Just to keep in mind that your code of conduct and procurement procedures are for last year. So we typically recommend that those are signed as of July 1st, 2023. So keep that in mind with your code of conduct and procurement procedures. The next thing is the micro-purchase self-certification. So that is a special form. Well, it's a certification. CDE doesn't really provide a template. We did create a template that you can use to like self-certify for the higher threshold. So we'll actually pop that link in the chat, and you can use that template when you're going through the review. So if you are using the $50,000 micro purchase self threshold, then you need to self-certify, and you can use this template in tandem with updating your procurement procedures. And together that kind of gives you that self-certification, so you can have anything under 50,000 be a micro purchase. Camille, do you want to talk about the rest of the list, the co-op and those items?
Yeah, definitely. One other note about that micro purchase self-certification too. So once again, that needs to be applied to the year under review, right? So school year 23-24, you would have wanted to certify for that micro purchase higher threshold. So same as like your code of conduct, procurement procedures, those are all for school year 23-24, which is being audited. For the procurement review checklist too, if you're like searching for it, CDE would have emailed it to you when they sent you the initial documentation. Of course, they have an acronym as well. They call it the LAPR checklist. So if you're trying to search, that's what it's called. It's not called procurement review checklist like we would all think, right? And then piggybacking contract with clause, that's on that LAPR checklist. They want to see that if you are piggybacking, that it was allowable in the initial solicitation document that you're piggybacking off of. So if you aren't sure where that contract is, I do a little digging to try to find it. Sometimes if you got set up by a vendor, you can reach out to a vendor for that original solicitation. Interagency agreement. So this one just applies to you. So it's if an SFA is providing meals and claiming for reimbursement of those meals that are served to students in an unaffiliated school. So the unaffiliated school is the one that's not the one claiming the meals, but they're paying for the meals. And so if that applies to you, then you'd want to include that interagency agreement or MOU as well. I think
Camille,
we got it all.
Yeah, so the interagency agreement, that only applies to people who purchase. It's about, for the procurement review, it's about what you purchase, not what you provide, right? So it only applies to, like, let's say you're a really small district and you're purchasing meals from a neighboring district, then you need to provide the interagency agreement. Is that right?
That's my understanding, right? Because that's the school that's actually procuring. If you're providing the meals, you're like the vendor for the meal program for the other school, right?
And then those fall under more like your non-program foods and stuff like that.
Yes,
not your procurement review. Okay, sounds good. And then the last two things are vendor paid lists and our procurement table, which we're going to get into here in a moment.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I remember, and thank you, Camille. I do remember back in June, you told folks to hold off on completing that procurement table until CDE released their initial documentation request. Since we didn't get into it then, could you walk us through it now?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get into a lot of detail about this lovely procurement table that is so beautiful, as you'll see in a moment. But first, we actually need to take a look at the vendor paid list because the vendor paid list needs to be completed first.
Got it. All right. Well, can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so just a few tips and tricks on the vendor paid list. So We have a template for this as well. It's essentially just a very simple Excel spreadsheet, like you see here, the little image in the upper right, vendor name, total spent. So that's all you're doing is getting your vendor name, total spent, put it in an Excel spreadsheet. So if you can export this from your financial system and then just kind of consolidate it, that's sort of the best way to do that. And then you want to make sure that you don't include any purchases that were made with kit funds if they were stored in the general fund. So you're only including stuff from Fund 13, not, if you have kit funds out in the general fund, you're not including that in this review. There's also a few other things to include and not to include. Camille, do you want to go through some of these?
Yeah, for sure. And when you're thinking about pulling that vendor paid list, like once we get into the table, you'll kind of see why I'm saying this, but for certain types of purchases, you're going to need to list out like how many times you purchased from a vendor. And so sometimes getting almost like two versions of this from your accounting system can be helpful, like a more detailed report where we'll list out every vendor, like every single time you purchase from them, so that you can actually add up for micro purchases, which we'll get to how many times you purchase from them. When you actually submit it, you're going to want this consolidated view. So some common questions that have come up quite often when working with clients is like things that we're seeing on that vendor paid list. We're like, wait, do we actually need to include that or not? So like bank charges are really common. You really don't need to include those. Employee reimbursements, most of the time you're going to be taking off all of those because usually they're for like travel or mileage. You don't need to include that. Other things that people have been consistently adding that you don't need. So if you're going to have a charge from the county for your health inspection, for example, they don't need to see that. You're not procuring your health inspection. It's a required payment. So you'll cross that off the list. You're not going to include that. In-house utilities, you would not include that. However, if you are paying for utilities out of your food service fund to a private company, you will want to include that. You might be thinking, well, I'm not procuring my utilities. It's just like who provides the utilities to my district. And I have to buy it from this private electricity company. The reason you're including it isn't actually to be reviewed on procurement. It's to look at whether or not it should be a direct or indirect charge. So that's why they still want you to include that information. Common things that you actually do need to include, obviously all of your food, your equipment, material supplies, computer software, any training. If you're paying like a contractor to do training, make sure you include that. Capital improvements, all of that needs to be included. Building leases, that's also kind of a confusing one sometimes. You still need to include if you're paying for leases as well. Anything else, Jen, you'd say common to come up during this process?
No, I think you covered it.
Ooh-wee. So now we can take that info and put it into our procurement table, right? Can you and Camille walk us through that?
Yeah, let's get to it. And if you have questions or thoughts as we're going through this, throw them in the chat box because we're going to have a nice little Q&A at the end. And yeah, feel free to throw your questions in the chat. So procurement table. Oh my gosh, look how beautiful. It is just the most beautiful spreadsheet I've ever seen. So calming when I look at it. Oh, thanks, Robert. So, okay. Yes, this is like a nightmare that you have to deal with filling this thing out, but we're going to try to make it a little bit easier and just make sure we cover all our bases. So first of all, taking a step back from the yellow highlighter, what do we actually have to put on this procurement table? So we're going to be looking at everything from that vendor paid list. So all the people you paid in 23-24, all the vendors and types of goods and services, except for, of course, the things that we just mentioned get excluded, like bank charges and utility, health inspection reports and that kind of stuff. But everyone else who's included on the vendor paid list is going to go on the procurement table. And it's broken down essentially by procurement type. So Camille, can you walk us through what we need to include for micro purchases?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to share these slides, right, Jen, with people who attend.
Yes.
I think
we'll send everything out tomorrow, probably. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I think this is a really great slide to use as like a checklist when you're gathering all your information up to actually enter in to the procurement table as well, because sometimes people start filling it out and they realize, oh, I don't actually know what the base year of my contract was. I need to dig that up. So this is a good just like start off checklist of what you need to start filling things out. So for micro purchases, you obviously need the names of all the vendors that you're entering in as a micro purchase, the total paid to those vendors, and the number of transactions. So when you're filling out this table for micro purchases, you're just going to list the vendor once, even if you purchased from them a bunch of times. For the micro purchase section, it's just the aggregate total throughout the entire year. So even if you bought from Safeway like 200 times, but it's a micro purchase, it's under 50,000, you just list it once on the table, put 50 as the total times you, total number of transactions. So that one's pretty straightforward. Jen, how about you talk about small purchases and how it's slightly different what you need to enter and how you enter it?
Yeah, definitely. It's similar, right? So you've still got the total paid to vendor, and then what they're also going to ask you is how many people you got to respond to the solicitation. So that's the extra kind of bit of information. So if you do a small purchase process, remember that one's also sometimes called like 3 bids and a buy. It's essentially price quotes. And so usually we like to get 3. At minimum, we try to get 2. If you only got price quotes from one person, that's sometimes gets a little bit tricky. But they're asking about number of responses. So Camille, can you count like people who respond but say, I'm sorry, I'm already at capacity, I can't provide services? Or is it people who responded just with price?
I would say it's an actual response. However, that's a really great point, Jen, and I would add that to the comments, because you could say, like, asked 3 vendors, only 1 was responsive. However, others responded and said they couldn't meet our needs. So that shows that like you did your due diligence, you tried to get some quotes. The other like piece of entering your small purchases too, that's like slightly different than your micro. It's like every time you do a small purchase, you have to list it out separate. So remember in micro, it's like everything lumped into one. But like what I often see is you might have the same vendor for equipment multiple times, like they got the best price every time. So you might list like Webstront, $60,000, we bought a cooler. Then you might list Webstront, like $75,000, we bought this oven. And so each time you went out and got those quotes, it's a separate procurement and a separate small purchase for the purposes of the table. So that's kind of like one, we'll dig into it a little bit more, but one nuance between the two.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good distinction, because you might be doing multiple small purchase processes, like especially with equipment, you're sending out a request at the beginning of the year for a bunch of small wares and you quote it out and Chef's Choice wins it. And then in December, you also do like a winter wish list of small wares because, you know, we need more stuff. And you send it out to 3 or 4 vendors again. Chef's Choice wins it again. Those are separate procurement processes, so they should be listed out separately on the table. And that way you're not bid splitting or anything like that. You're just listing out each procurement process because they were completely separate. Cool. So formal purchases, let's get into that, because that is a lot more information, and we'll have a visual on the table in just a moment. But as we look at formal purchases, there's quite a few things. So contract value, number of responses, similar, how many people responded to your bid. Was it a RFP or an IFB? And what kind of contract type? Usually it's always fixed price. Very few people ever do cost reimbursable. What was the contract duration, contract year, and whether there were any amendments. So this is the kind of detail you need for every formal purchase, which is a lot to gather up front, which is why this, like, Camille, you're spot on. This is like a really good kind of thing to look at as you're gathering stuff before you fill out the procurement table. Cool. So let's take a look at this again. So if we have this procurement table, it's like this huge spreadsheet. So we'll just break it down section by section. First section is very straightforward, just a quick visual on it. Like you can see, you just kind of enter your information, very basic. So we can kind of just click through these as you see, just entering your name, all of that, CNIPS number, who's the director, what they're responsible for. Yeah, and Kath, yeah, you can keep clicking through those. The main thing is that's the one, if you go back one, the 250,000. Yeah, that's probably the most important thing that you need to fill out here is to make sure you list what your small purchase threshold was for the review year. So in most cases, it's going to be 250,000 because that's like the small purchase threshold for federal and for California.
Yeah, and what Jen means by like small purchase threshold too, if you're like, what the heck is a small purchase threshold? If you haven't been on our other webinars, that's when you would have to go out to bid. Like if you're forecasting and it gets to that 250, then you for sure have to go out to bid. So your district might have a more restrictive one though. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and some districts do have a more restrictive one, like they restrict it at this like the state like ed services threshold, which is like, I don't know, isn't it like 113 or something like that? So just check with your district to know and use the one that you use for your program. So next up is the first little section of this spreadsheet. So we'll just kind of look at this, hone in on this area. So it starts out nice and easy, right? We're just going to pull over information from the vendor paid list. So all the names of those vendors and the amount that you paid, you literally just copy paste that over from the vendor paid list. This note here is to kind of, even though in your accounting system, it would only say, let's say Cisco in this example, if you were purchasing that through a cooperative or a piggyback, you're going to want to add that to the name. Is that right, Camille?
Yes. Yep. They want it just indicated right there so that they know ahead of time if they're going to pick that or that contract that it was part of a co-op.
Okay, so front and center for piggybacks and co-ops, like we can see here as well. Okay, so add that to your name of your vendor if it's a piggyback or a co-op, right there on the procurement table. And then we also are separating out procurements by unique procurement process. So just like we were kind of mentioning a moment ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is actually one of those tricky parts, even when you're pulling your vendor paid list, right? Because ideally, we can just like copy everything over. But if you have, what I've run into with a few different clients this year is you might have gone out to bid and the same vendor won various types of bids. So like you might have Gold Star for bread, they won the bread bid, Gold Star won the grocery bid. And so in that case, you would actually list them separately if they're two separate contracts on this table. So that might be a little bit more investigating you have to do to be like, what was this contract worth? What was this contract worth? So doing that homework ahead of time makes your life easier when you're filling out this table.
And sometimes that's tricky with like the accounting systems, because if they weren't necessarily separate POs, and separate invoices, they might not be tracked separately, right?
They might not be. Yeah, ideally, if you do have them set up as two separate contracts that they won, you should be able to track, hopefully, when you're paying down each contract, but it's not unheard of. It's not set up that way. So I think we're going to get to this too, but you'll have to enter the contract value as well for each of those contracts. So yeah, it might take some like backwards math to figure that out if you weren't separating it out to begin with.
USDA math, gotta love it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's perfect. And then another easy one, just describe what you purchased, right? So kind of, that one's real easy. Just kind of quick little description. Was that fruits? Was that bread? Was that whatever? The next part, it gets a little bit, it seems straightforward, right? Just classify by procurement type, but this can get really confusing really fast. So in general, ideally, you would, anything was a micro purchase where you just, went out and purchased it, you didn't get price quotes, and it was under 50,000 if you self-certify, or under 10,000 if you can't self-certify, that would be a micro purchase. Anything that was under 250,000 and you did price quotes, that would be a small purchase. And anything over 250,000, or if you just did like an RFP or invitation to bid, or like a piggyback or co-op, that's a formal. But it's not always that straightforward. So should we talk about some of the ways this can go awry, Camille?
Yeah. I think I've seen this quite a bit. If people get a head start on this tool before we've worked together, where they strictly classify by those thresholds, right? Because you're like, oh, falls in this dollar amount, it must be a small purchase. Falls within this, it must be a micro purchase. But what you're also looking at is the actual process you followed, which may not align with those dollar thresholds. So, for example, you might have gone out and gotten some price quotes to buy a new walk-in cooler. The total amount was pretty cheap. It was actually like $5,000 for that cooler. But because you went out
Cheapest
and
walk-in
followed the
ever.
small I know, right? That's the coolest example, but you're going to remember it because it doesn't make sense. So because you went out and actually got those price quotes, you're following that small purchase process, right? Like you got the quotes. So you would actually list that as a small purchase, even though it falls well below that $50,000 cutoff if you're self-certified. So it can also go the opposite direction. So say you ended up spending like $80,000 with Cisco, and you it technically falls, it's over 50,000, it's less than 250,000, so you might be like, oh, that's a small purchase. But when you think about how you actually decided to purchase from Cisco, it sounds like in this case there wasn't a competitive process. If you just were like, I'm going to go to Cisco, I'm going to buy this stuff. So in this case, you'd probably have to list micro purchase because you didn't do any price quotes, you didn't go out to bid for Cisco, regardless of how you indicated it. So say you said small instead, you're going to get TA either way, because if you indicated technical assistance, that's what TA is. If you indicated small purchase, they pick that procurement, they're going to ask you for those price quotes, and you're going to be like, oh, I didn't get any. I just decided to buy from Cisco. And then same thing if you pick micro, you may have a better shot, honestly, of justifying it a bit. Like, sometimes you have to buy from another vendor if your primary vendor can't give you the products you need. So if you have some justification like that, that might be a good way to document it on this table. So you could say Cisco micro 85,000 in the comments. We unexpectedly had to purchase more from an alternative vendor because our primary vendor wasn't able to meet our needs. You might still get TA, but in that case, we're able to justify it a little bit more. Jen, any other unique situations you can think about for how to categorize items?
Yeah, I think a good example of what you were just describing too is if you guys see here the Clover Stornetta farms on this procurement table, we listed that as a micro purchase on this example, but it was 120,000. And you might be like, wait, that looks wrong. It's over 50. It can't be a micro purchase. But this is an example of what she was just talking about of like, well, maybe it was because you really didn't do price quotes. You were just buying from Clover. And maybe you had good reason for that. Like mid-year participation went way up on something and you didn't realize until, and you tried to do another process and and sometimes we like to explain like, oh, we've already done an RFP or a small purchase procurement for the next school year. So that can help. But yeah, just go ahead and list things the way they were done, and know that like you might have a little bit of a technical assistance if you didn't, if you're not following perfectly into these thresholds. And you're not alone either if you have things that are like slightly off, and just kind of explain it as well. So another example, we had a client who spent like 70,000 with Domino's this year or on 23-24. And they were like, we were planning to make our own pizza under kit funds. We were like, had, all these dreams of doing pizza from scratch. We were not planning to buy Domino's, but it didn't work out with equipment deliveries. We tried to get pizza ovens. We tried to get staff. We had staffing shortages. Like we could not pull it together to get our pizza up and running. And so, yeah, we spent 80,000 on Domino's and it was a micro purchase because it was not planned. And it was kind of a last minute thing. So that just explain it if that happens. And then kind of show the process. Like with that client, we explained that an RFP was done for 24-25. Like at the end of the school year, when they saw they were going over, they immediately jumped into action with an RFP. But of course, it takes time to do that. So it's in effect for July 1st, 2024.
Yeah. And I mean, this all even if this process is a little frustrating, this actually could be a really helpful process for a lot of people to see how much they are spending. You know, how much are you actually spending with these vendors? Do you need to change your processes for the future anyway and get some price quotes to keep purchasing from certain vendors? So as tedious as this is, there could be some positives. So.
Silver lining. You're always good with that, Camille. Thanks. All right, so let's look at the rest of this table. So the next slide, we kind of have just the transaction. So Camille alluded to this earlier, but just for micro purchases, you will need to list the number of transactions. This is also something that you can just get from your accounting system, hopefully, and transcribe it over. So just basically the number of invoices or the number of like deliveries that you had, a number of orders. That's what that means. For formal purchases, you'll enter the contract value. So those are for your like formal bids, formal procurements. This one I do see clients having an issue with sometimes. Wouldn't you agree, Camille? Sometimes we don't. Yeah.
Yeah. So the way CDE wants you to fill out this section doesn't I wish I could just like star this as like top area to have questions, because they want you to fill it out based on the base year. So remember, you only fill out this contract value for your formal procurement. They want it for the base year of your contract. If 23-24 wasn't your base year, right? Like that's easy. You'll have it for 23-24. But say you started with Gold Star in 21-22, 23-24 is a renewal year. They want the 21-22 contract value. And they want what you thought you would pay to the vendor. So this might be like, if you did some calculations and you brought a number to the board, that's what you expected to pay that vendor that year. And then your vendor paid list is going to show the actual amount spent with the vendor during the year under review. So those years, like you're like, it doesn't align. They're never going to see the actual amount spent in 21, 22, or the base year of the contract. But it is still good insight for a reviewer to be like, oh, you estimated you were going to spend $250,000, and then 2 years later you're spending $500,000. Like, why did it go up so much? There might be questions related to that. So remember, for this one, you want the base year estimated value, not just last year's value of the contract. So if last year happens to be the base year, perfect, that's easy. But if it's not, you might have to dig a little deeper to find that value.
And what if there's no value listed on the contract?
Yeah, that's a little bit tricky. That's why I sometimes ask, like, a lot of people get a number approved to the board. So I'm like, that must be somewhat of an evaluation of what price would be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what you budgeted. Ideally, you would be looking at, you know, like when you go out to bid, you have an estimated usage, you have the amount that somebody bids on. What is that total value when you award that contract to that vendor?
Mm-hmm.
Don't feel bad if you're not doing this, because a lot of people are. So.
Yeah, we have a lot of clients that are like, there was no contract value listed. So
yeah,
in future, list the contract value, if you can, like on the contract, because then it's just super clear for you. But if not, that number you took to the board, or even what did you put in as your PO? Like that's like kind of an indicator as well, right? Like, okay, we plan to spend $300,000 and we put a $300,000 PO in. Maybe you can list that as well. Because in the lack of another number, put in what you budgeted or what you took to board or what you put in as your PO if it's not listed on the contract.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so that's that. We're making progress here. The last section is actually really hard to do because this spreadsheet is so massive. So we're going to look at that, but we sort of consolidated it into, like, I squished all the columns together and hid some columns so you could kind of still see the procurement type here. This isn't exactly how it'll look for you. You have to keep scrolling, but if you want to, you can hide columns while you're working on it to make it easier for you. So let's take a look at, for formal purchases, what you need to include. So you can see here, there's a few columns. So again, some of those things like we were saying that you need to collect ahead of time. Was this a vendor obtained through a co-op? Did you receive more than one solicitation? Was it a request for proposal or an invitation for bid? Is it fixed price? Most likely, yes, it's probably fixed price. Very rare to have cost reimbursable. What was the contract duration? Typically, it's 1 year. Very every now and then you might have a actual 3-year contract, but most likely people do 1 year contracts with option to renew. So that would be a 1-year contract. And then were there any amendments? Depends. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Yeah. And then there's a comment section where you can make a few comments, like if you piggybacked from Cardi B school district, you can write that there.
So Jen,
Food service. Yeah,
one
go
other
ahead. Yeah, what do you want?
question
What do you
about
want to
that.
point out on
Yeah.
this one?
So were there any amendments? You would consider an
Mm.
amendment if they went and got a price, like they changed the price, right? Like that's an amendment to the contract that they would have signed to agree to a price change, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of people are like, oh, we didn't amend it. Like we didn't change like the contract provisions, but like, I think you would still say yes. Yeah. Like if you just changed the pricing for your item. So I think it would be pretty often that you're going to say yes if it was amended, if you're not in the base year in 23, 24. Yeah, I think that's like the main question I see in this section.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. That's really good. A really good point. And then for food service management contracts, if you have one of those, you can see the columns here that you need to fill out, and they'll highlight. You won't be able to miss them. They're bright yellow. For small purchases, same thing. Similar questions like we kind of covered before. And then the last thing I want to mention here is just for all procurement types, at the very end of this spreadsheet, you can make comments. So like we said, if you can see the very middle one, that's where we had that micro purchase that exceeded. And we kind of explained we plan to do more scratch cooking, and we accidentally exceeded the micro purchase level due to staffing shortages for school year 24-25. We did a formal RFP. So you can explain some of that in here, as well as listing piggybacks, co-ops, if you had CDE approval for something. Kind of use this for those types of comments. Anything else that you would comment on, Camille?
No, I think you pretty much nailed it. It's like anything that you can provide a little bit more context or justification for, just to mitigate future questions. It's kind of like, this is what the state agency is looking at initially. And so anything that you think might be helpful for them to know, so they don't have to follow up with you later with more questions. So, yeah.
Wow, this is so incredibly detailed, and thank you both so much for walking us through every single step of the way. It's a lot of highlighting. It's a lot of yellow highlights. Actually, I was wondering, Camille, if you could give us some key tips for navigating those highlighted sections and filling out this whole procurement table.
Definitely. Yep, I know, right, Emma? There's so many highlights that you like to say, like, fill out the highlighted section. You're like, what? What do I need to do? So,
but also don't miss them.
Fill it all up.
It's
like so yellow, you do miss stuff. I don't know. It's just, yeah. Anyway, we don't need to go into that further.
Exactly.
So some procurement tips and tricks. So I know we've said this a few times, but for some reason it can be like hard to stick. But the way you list your piggybacks, like make sure you have vendor name and then the host district in parentheses. You need to say yes, like there's that one column where if it's a small purchase or a formal purchase, you have to say yes, it's a group purchasing cooperative. And then, yeah, because it's considered a co-op or group purchasing organization. So Jen, sometimes I'm wondering too, like, especially in California, group purchasing organizations, what would you consider, like, what would be a group purchasing organization for context? I don't ever see it. So
no, I haven't really seen it. You said you guys had more of those when you were in Montana, right? Like where schools and universities combined?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was like a specific organization. So like, I think like maybe the best way to describe it is it's kind of like a fee you might pay to a separate organization to get access to their like catalog. So it's like a separate organization that like monitors. Oh, or maybe like an agent, a procurement agent. Maybe they would fall under group purchasing because they're purchasing on behalf of the potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
just some like
Very
threshold
uncommon.
pushes.
We don't, yeah,
Yeah.
we work with a lot of districts and have done a lot of reviews over the years and haven't seen that as something we have to list. So
Yeah.
probably
Maybe
ignore
ask
it if you don't know
PD.
what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Most commonly though, we see a lot of piggybacks.
Yes.
So just make sure you enter them in the table correctly. And then same with your cooperative. So very similar. You're going to put the vendor name, cooperative name, say yes. Another like kind of sticky point is when you're looking at that table and say you are using a cooperative for Imperial Dade and you spent 35,000 and you were like, oh, well, that's like a micro purchase according to those like categories. But because your co-op went out to bid, you're going to list that as a formal because you'll have an actual contract that you would submit to be reviewed if that was selected. So something to keep in mind too when you're entering in those co-ops. So one more time, let's look at that table because I'm like, look, select yes in column H. So this is what we mean. You can see like the first kind of blue highlighted sort of section over here was this vendor contract obtained through a cooperative. That's what you would select yes for a formal, and then the column right over next to it, it's the same question basically, but you would select yes or no for small purchases. So kind of the tips and tricks for your co-ops and your piggyback. And then one other slide, this is just like a nice little summation of all those other tips and tricks we've kind of thrown out throughout the presentation. Yeah. So yeah, once again, like contract value, that's kind of a tricky one. Thinking about intention when you're figuring out how to categorize, it's not strictly those threshold numbers, but how you actually, like what process you actually followed. Utilities tend to be one of those questionable things. So once again, you'd include those utilities if they're purchased from a private entity. So if it's purchased from government entities or within the district, you don't need to include utilities. But if it's a private company, do include them. Point of sale software, this one has come up quite a bit because it's not as big of a deal if it's like, you know, like a $5,000 charge, whatever, that's, you know, easy to put on the table. But what if, you know, like what if your micro purchase threshold is $10,000 and your point of sale company is charging you $40,000? People are like, well, I'm not going to price compare that at this point. Like we've been using, you know, Mealtime or Titan or whatever for 10 years. Like, why would I be price comparing? You might have to do a little bit more digging into the initial procurement of that point of sale software. So going back to like, how did you decide to work with that company initially? Did you go out to bid for them? Did you price compare? Did you have some written specifications that you used to decide which POS company to go with? So you might just need to look into that a little bit more, find that original contract, see if like the renewal language is listed in there. So that one can be a little bit tricky for people. And then once again, I don't need to repeat these reminders again for the vendor paid list, but the vendor paid list has, like, the actual document has all of this listed out, like what you need to include and what you don't need to include on our template. So you can always reference that if you're not totally sure.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Camille. Thank you for all those tips. So this, I guess, brings us to the end of phase one, right? So after the procurement table is complete, what can everyone expect for phase two?
Yeah, so we mentioned the timeline a bit earlier, and so you'll get this initial documentation request or you'll submit it, and then you'll get another documentation request. You'll have 10 days to respond. Probably, hopefully, maybe by the end of October, you'll know a bit more about the timeline. And then only a handful of vendors are going to be selected, and they're going to be so you're going to have a lot of vendors listed on your procurement table that we just went over, but only a handful will be selected for further review. So this is the priority that they're going to go on. So they're going to be looking at, first of all, they're going to pick a sampling from each procurement type. So if you have micro purchases, small purchases, and formal purchases on your table, then they'll probably select like one from each category. Then within those categories, they'll look at solicitations that only received one response, because that's a little bit of a red flag. Was it a competitive process? Any of those group purchasing, like co-ops and piggybacks that we talked about, Anything that's higher, like the highest price, obviously more federal dollars being spent, they want to look at that. And procurement that exceeded the applicable threshold, like those instances where, oh, we spent 80,000, but it was a micro purchase, probably going to get selected. So those are the priorities that they'll be looking at. You won't know which vendors are going to get selected until you get that phase 2 documentation request. So you'll just kind of probably not too much to do now, but you can maybe start thinking about what these priorities are and have a little bit of a guess of which ones might get selected and maybe start getting some ducks in a row paperwork wise.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, especially if you're like a newer director and you're walking into a situation where you don't really know the history of a lot of procurements, but you're filling out this table and you're like, whoa, this one's for like $400,000. And you do some digging and you're like, I don't know where the original contract is, or like if you can look at that and you already know that that's your highest contract value, you'll probably have a good guess they might pick that. So I would maybe start doing a little bit of digging now, because you most likely are going to select that one. So,
Right.
And you might not have everything, but do the best you can to find that, unearth it from, the file cabinet.
Well, we don't know which vendors will be selected, but what types of documentation might be required?
Yeah, so you can see here, this is some of the types of documentation that they're looking for is some copies of invoices, the copies of the bids, of course. By American language will be reviewed to make sure that was in any food bids or food procurements. And remember, like, again, you only have 10 days to respond once you get that request. So that's some of the stuff you might want to start getting collected now if you're trying to work ahead.
Got it. And so we know that the sample of vendors will be selected from each procurement type included in our procurement table. But could you break it down a little bit more and tell us what type of paperwork will we need to submit?
Yeah, definitely. So, and we only have a few minutes left in our webinar, so you will get copies of these slides. So sorry if we go a little bit quickly here, but this is some of the documentation that you'll need for micro purchases. Micro purchase documentation is pretty straightforward. It's essentially just going to be any copies of invoices and purchase orders. They're usually looking at 3 invoices to see what was purchased. And then key is a written explanation of why the micro purchase method was used. So, and if you can go back one slide, that's all listed here. So, yeah, so you really want to be able to explain why you use the micro purchase method. And that's pretty much it for micro. For small, they're looking at a little bit more. So that's copies of specifications, price quotes. So even if you called and got a price quote, you can count that. You just want to make sure that, you have some sort of log, even if, you might be looking back and seeing what you did and jotting it down. But make sure you're able to show what you did for price quotes. And anything you want to add on this one for small purchase, Camille?
It says right here, like the contract and contract terms isn't necessarily required, but especially with like changes to the final like child nutrition rules regarding Buy American, like this is a really great opportunity to like provide information on Buy American to your vendors, because even if it's a small purchase or a micro purchase, you're still responsible for ensuring that you're purchasing domestic as much as possible. So that's why we highly recommend it too. Not only for that, but that's a really important piece of all procurement really. So.
Yeah. And really the big thing is making sure you can show like that you did a competitive process and who you sent price quotes to, what they responded, and that you went with the lowest priced responsible and responsive vendor, because that's the requirement. Small purchase, you have to go with price as the lowest. That's what you should be selecting the lowest price vendor. So that's kind of what they'll be digging into on here too. Make sure you got your price quotes and you selected the cheapest.
Yep, exactly. And there's no law that you have to like email vendors to get the price quotes. Like we have linked here, you can use that purchasing log to document the price quotes. But sometimes an email chain is a little bit easier to prove that you got the quotes. So.
Cool. And then the last thing is our formal purchase documentation. That is a lot more detailed. It's the full solicitation that was originally posted, the full responses from other vendors that responded, the evaluation criteria, like how you scored the RFPs, the contract terms. And one thing that I always have to go dig for is the advertisement. So remember, with formal procurement, you're supposed to post like in the public notices of the newspaper. Even if you weren't there, you might be able to find it in the archives of the newspaper if you know where it was posted, or if you forgot to save it, but you know you sent it to like the Daily Breeze and El Segundo, go contact them and see if you can like dig it up, because it should be somewhere. It's in the newspaper. But yeah, one thing to note here, in case this list looks a bit scary, remember it's a technical assistance review this year. So we're not going to be like getting fiscal action or anything like that for anything you don't have. It's just kind of like technical assistance, slap on the hand, if you will. But yeah, try your best to get everything that they are asking for on the formal purchase documentation.
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of times people, a lot of questions I've gotten about the public notice is like, well, we put it on our website. That's public. But that's not California law. So you have to still put it in the newspaper officially for it to count in this case. So watch out for that.
All right. So let's say you've submitted all your documents, answered all the questions. How will CDE be reviewing everything?
Yeah. So I'll take this since I used to do these reviews. I'm not CDE, but we'll still go through what they'd actually do if we were the reviewers here. But what they're doing is they're looking at all of your documentation that you submitted during that part one, right? And then they're also looking at part two. They're putting it all together. They're reviewing your code of conduct, making sure that it's meeting all of the requirements that need to be in a code of conduct. They're going to look at your procurement procedures. They're going to make sure you're not missing any important sections of your procurement procedures. Then they're going to look at all those pieces of documentation that you submitted to them for each type of procurement that they selected. So, if you didn't have any micro purchases, they're not going to obviously do a micro purchase review. But if you had micro purchases, they're going to look at those invoices. They're going to make sure each individual invoice was below the micro purchase threshold. Small purchases, they're looking once again at those invoices to see that you purchased the things that you said you were going to purchase. And then they're going to also look to see that you got those price quotes. So you had price quotes, you had invoices, you had what we call specifications, so a list of actually what you were trying to procure. For that formal procurement, that's where they're going to be looking at quite a bit of documentation. They're looking at your original solicitation, your RFP, your ISB, looking at your advertisement, they're looking at your scoring, all of that goes into that. They're evaluating it. They have their own tool that they're filling out to make sure that they get all their questions answered. They might have quite a bit of back and forth with you during this time because they have to get their questions answered too. So they're looking at your stuff, they're asking clarifying questions. And then once it's all done, they're done looking at everything, then they'll be ready to close things out with you, and they'll provide a technical assistance report with you. They provide like an executive summary, email, a technical assistance review report. And they'll go through all those different areas. And like Jen already mentioned, this is a technical assistance review. I believe it's the last year of technical assistance reviews. So they might write things up as errors. And I know that can feel a little bit scary, but if you've been through an administrative review, you know that that's not a technical assistance review. And if you have errors, you have required corrective action. Here, they'll tell you what the fix is, but they're not going to require you to submit documentation showing that you made the fix. Now, if you didn't fix it and they come back during the next cycle, they're going to look back at that. So keep this report, work on those fixes, but they're not going to require you to submit them to them following the review.
Oh, wow. So it does sound like a lot of back and forth, but I guess it's done now. So that's phase 1, 2, and technically phase 3 with the closeout, right? Thank you so much, Camille, and thank you so much, Jen, for answering all these questions, for digging really deep into the procurement review process. So just to wrap everything up, I wanted to let everyone know that the follow-up resources will be sent to all registrants. And for pro members, the recording, slide deck, and all related materials will be available in the resources library shortly. after this webinar closes. And next up, our administrative review prep webinar is going to be taking place next month for another in-depth overview of going through the administrative review. So look forward to that. In other exciting news, we will be releasing some new lessons on procurement to the LunchAssist Pro training library, so be on the lookout for those. And as a reminder, the LunchAssist Pro membership gives you access to on-demand training, handpicked resources, and a professional standards tracking tool all in one place. Plus, you can add on extras like our Spanish video library and AR Bootcamp. Even though our MVP, Mike, is not on the call today, please don't hesitate to schedule a call with him to learn more. I'll drop his email into the chat, or you can book a time on his calendar. Okay, and I do want to get into our Q&A because we did get some juicy questions into the chat. If folks have to hop off at the top of the hour, this recording will be available, as I mentioned, afterward.